Hello and welcome back to another beginner series. So today it's going to be all about watercolor pencils. I'm going to be going through all of the supplies that you'll need. So I've got all of my favorite papers, brushes, what pencils I use. Then in the next video, I'm going to show you how to use the pencils, how I like to blend them out, different techniques that you can use. And then we're going to go ahead and do an artwork at the end of this series using our watercolor pencils. So make sure you subscribe, hit the like so I know that you're enjoying this series, and make sure you hit the notification bell so that you're notified when those other videos come out. So I'm going to start with my favorite papers that I use, and I have a few examples for you here. So I'm going to start with this one. Usually I tend to pick more hot pressed type papers with my watercolor pencils, but I've recently been trying out some more cold pressed papers. So this is the Academy cold pressed paper, and this was actually a watercolor block. And what I did was just take the paper off and I taped the edges down like this, and then I just did the illustration or the artwork right on my desk with it taped down, so I get a nice little border like this. You could also do it while it's on the block itself, and you would just get right up to the edges. But I really liked using the cold pressed paper because you can still see a little bit of that cold pressed texture through the paper, whereas some of these other ones are quite smooth, so you can really see the difference there. And especially in the flower, this one I tried not to layer the pencils up as much, so I still have a little loose sort of watercolor looking flower. But as you can see with these two flowers here, I did layer up the pencils a little bit more to get more of the smooth texture. So that's one of the really cool things with watercolor pencils, is you can get a more watercolor type look if you don't layer them up as much, or if you want a more opaque colored pencil look, you can get that as well. Now I have used Arch's cold pressed paper as well, and that works just as good. I just don't have any of those pieces left with me. Now the next paper that I have here is the Arch's hot pressed watercolor paper. I absolutely love this paper. It's one of my go-tos for quite a few different mediums, but as you can see here, this is just a couple of layers of the watercolor pencils, and because it's a smoother paper, it does have a lot of tooth in it if you're using colored pencils, but because it's a little bit more smoother, the watercolor pencils I find layer up so nicely that you can get a nice smooth transition, and it looks like colored pencils. So I really like the Arches paper for that. Now, this is one of my new favorite papers, and this is actually the Strathmore 500 series watercolor paper, and this is in cold pressed. Now, I like this because it's more of a smooth cold pressed paper, and I have it in the smaller size here. So these two were done with this paper. Now, this one I actually used watercolor in the background, and then I went on top with watercolor pencils to do the flower. So I really like that this paper can handle both watercolor and watercolor pencils, because I find that gives a really unique look having the two together in one piece. Now with this one, I did layer the pencils up a little bit more, so I have more of a smooth look with the flower. Whereas this one, I tried to leave it a little bit looser, so you can see some of the watercolor texture and markings in here, and I didn't blend everything out completely, especially in the cookies here, to try to create some of that cookie texture. But this paper, even though it says it's cold pressed, I find it's a little more on the smooth side. So I don't know if you guys can see, but this one has more texture than the Strathmore hot pressed 500 series does. But I find it's still so smooth that it acts like a hot pressed watercolor paper, but it actually takes watercolor and it blends the pencils out super well. So this paper is quickly becoming one of my favorite ones for watercolor pencils. But now let's jump into my favorite watercolor pencils and why I like them so much. These are the Faber-Castell Albrecht watercolor pencils, and they are hands down my favorite watercolor pencils that I've tried so far. Now, I do keep them in this little flip binder. I find this easiest for me, and I can just flip through and see them. Now, I used to use the Derwent watercolor pencils. These come in a set of 60, and the Albrecht come in a set of 150. And I'm going to tell you why I chose the Faber-Castell over the Derwent. Now, these are the Derwent watercolor pencil swatches, and I just use this Canson mixed media book for all of my swatches, but this is the Derwent ones, and it only comes in 60 colors. However, that's more than enough colors to get you by because they do blend out so good. So as you can see, they do blend out fully, even with just a little bit of water. But just look at the difference between the color saturation. So these are a little bit more muted. And if we flip over to the Faber-Castell, you can see just how vibrant these watercolor pencils are. And if you guys know me by now, you know I like some nice vibrant colors. But they are so nice and vibrant. So I'm just going to flip back and forth so you can kind of see the difference. Now these blend out really nicely. And these blend out, I feel like they blend out just a little bit more. They're just so much more smoother, and you can get a nicer transition and really drag them out. You can do that here too, but I find you can get just a little bit more of the pencil texture in here, whereas these are like completely blended out. So that's sort of the difference here, and I'll just show you the other swatches. So those are more brown colors. So that's one reason that I chose the Faber-Castell Albrecht over the Derwent pencils, and I find that the Faber-Castell blends out more smoothly than the Derwent does. So depending what your style is, you might want to choose one over the other. Price point, I feel like they're fairly close. I have more color choices in the Faber-Castell Albrecht than I do with the Derwent. However, if you're a fan of the Inktense pencils, then you might gravitate more towards these because these are the exact same color as the Derwent Inktense pencils or the Inktense blocks. So if you use those more, then these might be more your style. I feel like these can be a little bit more opaque than these ones, but the Faber-Castell ones layer up so beautifully. Now, if you're a big fan of the Polychromos from Faber-Castell, then you might gravitate towards these pencils more because these ones are the exact same colors as the Polychromos. So like the Derwent and the Inktense and the Derwent blocks all follow each other. These are the exact same colors as Polychromos. So you could always do a base layer with your watercolor pencils and then go on top with your Polychromos to create your details, because Polychromos are perfect for that because they have nice hard leads. You can really get in there and create some details. So for example, with this picture, I used just the watercolor pencils for this, and I used them wet, and then I went in and created a little bit of texture in here with the watercolor pencils. However, you could use those colored pencils to achieve that look as well. So it just depends what your style is, if you like to use both, or maybe you just want to experiment. One other thing I want to point out about the Faber-Castell Albrecht, and I don't know if it's just these watercolor pencils specifically, but I just want to show you here. So I did this base layer where I put the yellow in, and then I went on top and created some of these shadow areas. Now, once I blend my first layer or my base layer out, or any subsequent layers, every time I layer over top of it, I feel like that layer sort of really settles into the paper, and it doesn't move unless you're really scrubbing hard to try to get rid of that paint underneath. But I feel like these become permanent once you blend them out, which is perfect for my technique and style because I love to sort of layer up. So I'll do a base layer, and then I'll come in and do some more details and shadows. And as I blend that layer out, it's not disturbing the layer underneath. So I don't know if it's a combination of the paper that I use or just the pencils themselves, but it works perfect for the techniques that I like to use. So now I'm going to show you guys the brushes and the tools that I use along with these pencils to blend them out and do different techniques. But I just want to quickly mention this brush here, or this type of brush. So any brushes where the bristles are a little bit stiffer, so sort of like your Simply Simmons type brushes, I find these are great for blending out colored pencils with Gamsol or odorless mineral spirits, but they're not great for blending out watercolor pencils. These aren't my favorites, but what I do really like is either these more fluffy type brushes. So this is my Silver Black Velvet and my Princeton Neptune, and these are much more fluffy. So as you can see here, the bristles are a lot more soft, and that helps me get a much smoother transition. So if we look at this example here, so I did the background all with my Princeton Neptune brush, And I was able to get really nice soft transitions in between all of the colors and no hard edges. And that's how I like to do bigger areas. So if I want an area where I want the colors to be very smooth, same with like on the chick with the cookies on top, I did the pot using my silver black velvet brush. I was able to get a nice smooth base layer. Then when I want to go in and blend out more detailed areas, that's when I'll switch to my watercolor brushes. Now what watercolor brushes are, they are sort of the exact same. They're a little bit between, I would say, a stiff bristle and a very soft bristle, but they have these little reservoirs here, so you can twist this off, and I just fill it up with a little bit of water. You can use a pipette, or you can go right under your sink to fill them up. And I find the ones that I use have really good water control. I've tried some where as soon as you tip it up and go to use it, it just puts out way too much water, and that can cause some blooms, and it can make a bit more of a hassle for you. But these water brushes, they're actually pretty cheap and affordable, and they're the best ones that I've tried yet. So I usually have these linked down below in my videos. So if you're curious, you can go ahead and check these out. But these are hands down my favorite. So anywhere in my more detailed areas like this, I'll tend to use my water brushes. And what I do is I just will do an area, and then anywhere I'm transitioning between colors, or if I'm transitioning between light and dark, I literally just wipe it like that, and I'll wipe it like this and go, and that is honestly enough to get the color off of this. So it's pretty quick. Whereas when I'm using a brush like this and I want to transition between different colors or smaller areas, I have to really go in, rinse it well, dab it off, kind of go back. So on a background like this, because I want a really nice smooth transition and similar colors between the backgrounds, but here in the flower, I have a lot of different colors going on, and I don't want this dark color to smudge into the light color. So it's so much easier just to take my water brush and start here and then just wipe it and keep going, and then get into this dark area, and I've got to go back into the light, so I just wipe it like that. And I don't have to worry about too much water coming out. So that's the difference between these two brushes and why I would use one over the other. It just depends what I'm blending out at the time. Now, one of the really cool things with watercolor pencils is they pretty much act like watercolors. So you can use any of the same supplies that you would use with your watercolors. So for instance, you could mask out some areas if you wanted to keep some highlights, and that would be totally fine. You just have to be a little bit careful going around with your pencils around this area, because masking fluid is a little bit more sticky. So if you're pushing the pencil into that area, it could potentially grab onto this and lift a little bit of it. But because the watercolor pencils blend out so nicely, you honestly don't have to go right up to the masking fluid, and then you can use your brush to blend over the masking fluid, and these are gentle enough that it's not going to lift the masking fluid when you start blending it out. Also, you could use something like your bleed proof white, or you could use gouache to create those white highlights on top of your work. So for instance, here where I just went along some of the edges and I wanted a little bit more highlight to stand out, I actually used my white Inktense block. Now I love using this in combination with either my Inktense pencils or my watercolor pencils, because I can be super controlled with this and just hit those little areas that I need, and it's not so opaque. Sometimes going in with gouache or the bleed proof white, it's a little bit more opaque and it stands out, but I find this, it actually looks like watercolor pencil, so you can't really tell any difference. There's no shininess, whereas with the bleed proof white, I can tell sometimes that it's an added medium on top because it's either too opaque or it's a little bit shiny, but this one blends in really nicely. Now I also have this Caren palette, and this is pretty cool because you've actually got one side that is very smooth, and this would be for more watercolor if you wanted to mix a watercolor on it. However, it is a pretty tiny palette, so I don't really use this side that much. Or if you had other paints, I wouldn't use acrylic or anything on that because it is going to be really hard to come off. But the other side, it's got this very textured side, and this is great for any water-based medium. So Inktense, Caren Neocolor 2s, your watercolor pencils, all you do is scribble these on there, and then you can take your brush and some water and wet that out and use it just like watercolor. So that's really cool. So if you wanted to do your base layers with this, you could just put your colored pencils on here, and then you have all your different spots for your colors, and you could use this as your palette. Do your base layer and then go over top with colored pencils or your watercolor pencils to create those details. But this is really cool. But in the next video, I'll show you an alternative to using this in case you don't have one, because not everybody has one or wants to pay for one just to use with your colored pencils. So I'll give you guys a very cheap alternative to this. And then one of the last things I use is this colored pencil sharpener. So this is the Durer Super Point Mini, and I use this with my colored pencils, but obviously it still works with my watercolor pencils. Now, I always say with watercolor pencils, unless you want really tiny detail, you don't have to have them that sharp at all. And most of the time when I'm just doing bigger areas, my pencils are pretty blunt. And then when I want to go in and do some little tiny details, that's when I'll go ahead and sharpen them up. But even then, they don't really have to be super sharp, because you could put them on here and then you could go in with a smaller liner brush or whatever you want and get that detail in that way. It just depends what way you like to work with them. So those are all of the basic supplies that you need to get started with watercolor pencils. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to use them, how to layer them, how to blend them out, and different techniques that we can use with them. And then we'll finish this series off with an artwork. So make sure you subscribe, hit that notification bell, and hit the like button so that I know that you like these series and I will continue to do them. But thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one.